Zochreinu lechaim, melech hafetz b'chaim, v'chotveinu b'sefer hachayim, lemancha Elohim chayim. Remember us for life, God who desires life. Write us in the book of life for your sake, God, for life. When I think about the Sefer HaChaim, the book of life, I think about a physical book, one of my favorite books in the world. It's called Portraits, 9/11/01. And that book has resided in the Bayit for most of the last 20 years. And if you open to any page, you'll find it bursting with life, with the lives of those who perished 20 years ago today. Lives of love, lives of service, lives of possibility, complicated lives, lives of rich and lives of poor, lives of people of all backgrounds, all races, all religions. I love on 9/11, even with a heavy heart, opening up and meeting people I've never met before, and connecting with their lives. Maybe it feels ironic to call this a Sefer HaChaim, book of life, because everyone in this book died 20 years ago. But for me, it's bursting with life. And this 9/11/2021 is dedicated to those some close to 3,000 lives, to the pledge that in some way, through our learning, through our reflecting, and through our hoping to grow, we give more life to their lives. What I hope to do in the time we have together on this Motzaei Shabbat Shuvah is to suggest that actually reflecting on 9/11 can be an experience of Teshuvah, not because anyone who died, God forbid, or any of us sinned on that day, but because there can be a different definition of Teshuvah that I want to offer tonight alongside the classical and perhaps modern views. A notion of Teshuvah as reflecting on past events for the purpose of understanding our world and ourselves better. And moving forward from that definition of Teshuvah, I hope to offer two personal reflections. That is to say, the things that I've especially been thinking about in these recent weeks, thinking about where we are 20 years later from 9/11/01. Each of us, sorry about that. Each of us, I know, in our own ways, would offer very different and diverse reflections of what it means to be 20 years removed and connected from and to 9/11. These are two of my own thinkings which I hope will also connect us to the themes of the high holidays that run through these two thoughts and these two reflections, to get dedicated to remembering and honoring the lives and legacies of those who perished 20 years ago today. Let's begin. What is Teshuvah? Perhaps many of us and our minds turn to the classic definition offered by the Rambam. It starts with a sin, a wrongdoing, a misdeed, or a mistake, and brings us on a journey of reflecting on what we did wrong, of regret and remorse, of trying to change ourselves, resulting in a commitment that if we were to find ourselves in a similar situation, we would not make the same mistake again. Classic Teshuvah, repentance. Or maybe it's the Teshuvah as return, as Rav Kook so beautifully describes in his Orot HaTeshuvah. It's the flourishing of a soul that longs to connect to its roots. It's coming to connect with our deepest selves. coming to connect with the deep unity of Am Yisrael and all humankind and its longings and yearnings, coming to connect with God and the goodness that's at our core. But in thinking about 9/11 and reflecting back, I wanted to offer tonight another definition of Teshuvah that comes from turning back to the very verb that is the source of Teshuvah in the Bible, the verb lashuv, to return. Normally, when I think about returning, I think about a geographic motion, a physical motion from a place I am to a place I once was. One of the best examples is the story of the sale of Yosef. Reuven leaves Yosef in the pit, planning to return and rescue him a little bit later. Vayashov Reuven el habol. Reuven returned to the pit. V'hinein Yosef babul. He came back to the place he planned to come back to. Yosef was no longer there. Vayashov el echav. So he came back to his brothers and he lamented, what happened to the boy in the pit? Where did Yosef go? Returning back to a place, returning back to the next place. That's the classic understanding of Teshuvah, a geographic return. But Kohelet, the ultimate philosopher and reflector in our tradition, does a different kind of returning in source 1. In chapter 4 of Kohelet, verses 1 and 7, after offering many reflections, he says, Vishavti ani va'ereh. Literally, I returned again and I saw. You see that the translation doesn't translate literally, but rather I further observed and I have noted further. A sense that lashuv v'lirot is to build upon previous understandings with a new one. But literally it means I returned and saw the same thing in a different way. We can call this in a very literal sense, reviewing, to see again, to go back, not in space, but in time, or maybe in our mind's eye, to something which happened to us in the past, to an experience we previously had, and look at it again. It hasn't changed. It's a static moment in time. But we have changed. The world has changed since then. Perhaps a piece of Teshuvah is lashuv lirot, to go back to past experiences and try to understand ourselves in light of them and understand them differently with the passage of time in light of ourselves. As a companion text, I want to share one of my favorite texts about Teshuvah in source 2. It's the story of the cycles of the judge, the beloved judge of the Jewish people, Shmuel, one of our passionate and compassionate and strong leaders. Shmuel judged the Jewish people all the days of his life, but how did he judge? Every year he made the rounds, v'halach midei shana b'shana v'savav. He made a circuit, Beit El, Gilgal, Mitzpah, and he judged the Jewish people, led them in all these places. And then one of the only places where the word Teshuvah in its full sense appears, Uteshuvato haramata kisham beito. Then his Teshuvah was to return home, to Ramah, where he came from. And there he judged the Jewish people too, and built an altar there to the Lord. There's something, this is of course, is a geographic returning, but it's a geographic returning which evokes a sense that when we go back to homes, and homes need not just be our geographic homes, when we go back to anchor experiences, to watershed moments, to things that define us and that are somehow familiar to us, no matter how far we stray from them, there's an experience of Teshuvah, of returning, which is necessary no matter how far out we go on our cycles. We have to come back again to those anchor experiences. A Pew survey found that more than any other experience in American history, many people, the most people alive today, said 9/11 was the most watershed experience they experienced in their lives as Americans. In a sense, it is a home. It's a bayit for us, which we all lived in together for a moment. And wherever we go in our lives and in our world, Utshuvato haramata kisham beito, wherever we go out leading, connecting with people, somehow we have to return to this place every year to see how we're different, to see what's changed, and to think about how we want to be going forward. So that's the frame of Teshuvah that I offer us tonight. The Teshuvah is not just about repairing our mistakes, fixing our sins. And it's not just about connecting with ourselves, with God, and with community. It's also about returning to watershed moments that we experienced as individuals and as a collective, as an American people and as a world, and asking, where are we now? And in what ways is it still with us? So as we move to the first of the two reflections I want to share tonight, one of my returning experiences, I want to invite you for a moment to close your eyes with me and go back 20 years to this morning. Where were you? How did you receive the news? Who were you with? What did you feel? What was the rest of that day like? And the rest of that week? And the rest of that month? And the rest of that year? And in some way, take a quick journey through 20 years. What remains with you today from then? What are the legacies of that moment in your life? And how do you experience the world differently because of how the world has changed because of then? I know we each have a myriad of thoughts, experiences, and reflections, and I want to share two of mine about things I live with in the wake of 9/11 that stay with me. Challenges and hopes. The first is a reflection that has been with me since hearing the words of Captain Adrian Bonenberger on a New York Times daily podcast in May. Captain Bonenberger was a Yale graduate whose life experiences and whose experience learning about Abu Ghraib led him to want to devote some of his leadership talents to the military. He joined the US Army and 10 years ago was deployed to Afghanistan. At that time, the New York Times, this was in a time of military surge, the New York Times embedded reporters with his unit. They traveled with him, they reflected with him as he took his men through the experiences of those months, 10 years ago today, at the halfway point. And then in May of this year, they revisited with him 10 years out from his deployment in Afghanistan and asked him how he reflects on that time. It was easy for me to find these words again in the transcript of that podcast because I would not be exaggerating if I would say they come back to me on almost a weekly basis since then, like a sock in the gut. Here's what he said. 10 years out from my experience of the war in Afghanistan, it seems like Afghanistan has been reduced to the thing it was before I came. And this is such a corny metric of progress, but like when we left Imam Sahib district, Kunduz province, Afghanistan, I saw two young women wearing blue jeans, which sounds like such a ridiculous thing now. You know, it's sort of like a cliche and a joke, like, oh great, America got some women to wear blue jeans. I guess we really won the war there. At the time, it felt very significant to me. It felt like this is a place where people kind of feel free to express themselves, you know, symbolically. And then within a week of our leaving, about half of the people that I had worked with were assassinated. And then within a year, the rest of them had been assassinated. So all of the leaders that I worked with in Afghanistan are now dead, and were dead within a year of our leaving. And I think 2 or 3 years after we left, the Taliban retook much of Kunduz. I think they briefly occupied the city. And at this point, it's probably about where it was when we started out. I want to try to transcend whatever political implications we take from these words and truly, truly view them as one human's experience. A person who is compelled by a mission, and it's a mission that reasonable people can and have disagreed about its scope, about its cost-benefit analysis, about its goals, about its timeline, about the impact that it had on the soldiers who were called into duty for it, and on the Afghani people who were deeply impacted by it, on our nation and on their nation. We and reasonable people can, have, and will disagree about the details to this approach as long as we revisit this question. But for Captain Bonenberger, it was a mission, a goal, and a vision he felt deeply called to and deeply invested in. He poured a year or so of blood, sweat, and tears, literally blood and sweat and tears, and the blood and sweat and tears of the people who were entrusted to his care, into trying to achieve that goal. And weeks, and then years after he left, it all fell apart, back to where we began. It's hard to narrow from what I think of as the big picture of his experience to our own lives, but I want to try to walk that bridge for a moment. On Slichot night, with Rabbi lifting us all up at the concert and at Slichot, I have the custom of pulling out my phone for a few moments and jotting down some notes. My first hopes, my first goals, my missions for the year ahead. And I've shared this thought before, but it always stays with me. I know that if I would pull out the note from the year before, many of the same hopes and goals and missions would be there. And I would probably say about them that I succeeded in some of them, in some of Elul, and in some of Tishrei, and maybe even into Mar Cheshvan. And now I'm back where I started. I put a lot of effort in, and I wound up right back where I began. And when I look at those things, I experience a sense of failure and a tremendous feeling of disappointment that comes along with it. It doesn't compare in my perspective to what I can only imagine Captain Bonenberger feels. When I try to put myself in his shoes, I feel a paralysis and couldn't even imagine getting out of bed the next morning. But each in our own way, we have a set of projects, a set of goals, a set of things we try to achieve in the world. And sometimes, with some of them, despite our best efforts and pouring our hearts and souls into them, we don't succeed. And we look at them with great disappointment. How do we cope with those disappointments? How do we try to move forward in our lives when the things we hoped to achieve feel like they've fallen on their faces and we have fallen on our faces? I look to the Bible, to the Tanakh, for thoughts about this question. And the first place I looked is to find the biblical word for disappointment. There's no shortage of stories in which biblical characters, perhaps first and foremost God's self, experiences disappointment. God created the human and placed the human in the Garden of Eden with but one charge, and Adam did not succeed. God allowed people to flourish on the earth and they quickly became corrupted, and God regretted having created them. We founded a nation and went out towards the promised land with an incredible leader, Moshe Rabbeinu, who poured his heart and soul into protecting and serving and leading and guiding us. And time again, with our complaints and rebellions, we failed him. And as we look at the experience of those characters, God as God, leaders, patriarchs and matriarchs, with hopes unmet, with expectations dashed, we find anger, we find punishment, we find regret. We rarely find a word that seems to encompass a sense of disappointment. And I'm not sure why that is, whether it's a kind of a psychological notion that the Bible would not quite have expressed in those words. But it struck me that we, the speakers of modern Hebrew, have a very clear word for disappointment. Achzava, lehit achzev. I've tried to instill this word in my children from a very young age because I have no doubt that part of what it means to grow up is to experience disappointment over and over and over again. And I want to arm them with the opportunity to put words to their feelings. So we talk about achzava in our house and feelings of disappointment, not infrequently. But when I backed up to ask the question of where the modern Hebrew word achzava came from, took me on a journey back to the Chumash. And I want to invite you on that brief journey with me to reflect on the sources of the notion of disappointment in the Tanakh, and then to try to glean from it a drop of thoughts and possibilities of how we cope with disappointment. Yirmiyahu the prophet is perhaps one of the first to try to touch on the notion of this term. In an incredible passage in which he does something which the prophets probably did more than was recorded in the books of prophets, must undoubtedly have expressed sometimes, but we rarely were privy to. He expresses his sense of incredible frustration at the impossible mission God has sent him on, to relay critique and charge and exhortation to a people who didn't want to hear it, who responded with mockery and scorn and punishment to him, the prophet, the agent of God's message. Yirmiyahu turns to God about his suffering at the hands of the people, about never being heard and heeded, and says, why must my pain be endless, my wound incurable, resistant to healing? Hayo tihiyeh li kamo achzav, mayim lo ne'emanu. You, God, have been to me like a spring that fails, like waters that cannot be relied on. The notion of achzav in the Bible is a natural phenomenon. It's a spring that we come to. We see it there in the ground, and waters aren't bursting forth. The thing that's supposed to happen doesn't seem to happen. And Yirmiyahu says to God, that's what you have become to me. The one who is supposed to make sure that my words are carried forth, the one who's supposed to reassure me, and instead you keep sending me on these missions that feel like failures. You have become to me an achzav, a spring that fails, waters that cannot be relied on. It's striking to hear Yirmiyahu call God an achzav, to put it in modern Hebrew terms, a disappointment, a bearer of false promises or reassurance. Because from none other than Bilam, the non-Jewish prophet, we hear the opposite message, contrasting God to human beings. Lo ish el v'chazev in source 6, uven adam v'yitnacham. Hahu amar v'lo ya'aseh v'diber v'lo yikimena. God is not like human beings. God is not capricious. God does not change God's mind. And here we have some of the languages which come closest to perhaps disappointment or regret, the language of nun chet mem, which is used when God seems to regret creating human beings. A similar notion is expressed by God in another place. God felt a sadness close to disappointment. But none other than Bilam says, God is not a human being who would be capricious, who would speak and not act, promise and not fulfill. So here we both get a sense that kazav, which if you would have stopped me before searching this term out in biblical Hebrew, I would have simply said means to lie or to deceive. But now we have a deeper sense that it means to make a promise you're not going to keep, to create disappointment. That's something which human beings do, but God does not do. Yirmiyahu seems to have experienced for the moment, and we'll come back to that, God as that. But Bilam assures that that's a human characteristic, not a divine characteristic. And to its being a human characteristic, the psalmist says in Psalm 116, and I want to read this twice. First, Ani amarti b'chafzi kol ha'adam kozev. I said in my suffering and frustration, all human beings are disappointers, are promise makers that they can't keep. At first, it seems to support this notion from Bilam's mouth. God is not a disappointer, but human beings fundamentally baked into what it means to be human is to disappoint, to make promises we can't keep, to put up a word that we won't follow through on. That's who we are almost by nature. But let's read it again. Ani amarti b'chofzi, in my haste, out of frustration, perhaps I said, kol ha'adam kozev. But it's not a necessary part of human beings. It's a pitfall we have to be aware of, but we can transcend it. It's definitional about God that God will not disappoint. For human beings, it's a risk, but not an absolute. It's something we have to wrestle with so much that in the Yom Kippur Machzor, time and time again, in the coming days, in the day of Yom Kippur, which is coming in just a few days, as we beat our chests, we'll say, Val chet shechatanu lefanecha b'chachash u'v'chazav. for the sins that we committed in front of you, God. And prior to this week, I would have said in lies and other lies. But now I would say it's false denial. This is a beautiful translation. False denial and false promise. Kazav is false promise. It's disappointing others. That's the pitfall, one of the pitfalls we hope to avoid by reflection on Yom Kippur. When did we make a promise or offer a word we couldn't follow through on that resulted for others in disappointment? Perhaps one of the greatest fears of disappointment is that which was expressed by a woman hoping to bear a child. A deep, deep experience that so many have wrestled with and struggled with. The Shunammite woman, whom when Elisha promised her that she would embrace a son, she said to him, Al Adoni, Isha Elohim, Al Techazev v'shivchatecha. Not don't lie, but don't make a promise you won't be able to keep. I'd rather you just tell me I wouldn't have a child than you give me hope if those hopes are to be dashed. Don't disappoint me. And of course, it's powerful to see that Elisha is, of course, an Ish, Elohim. He sits on that space. If he's an Ish, he's liable to perhaps disappoint. If he's Elohim, if he's an agent of God, he won't disappoint. And that's what the Shunammite woman, in a sense, was asking. Are you bringing a divine promise I can rely on? What these sources invite us to consider is how profound the experience of disappointment can be. That it's something which is in so many ways baked into human experience and almost unavoidable, but that somehow what we strive to be, which is to be like God, is not to be those who disappoint others. But how do we cope with disappointment? That was, after all, one of the titles of the Derashah. And all I've done here is to show you how profound and deep and real disappointment is. So when I turn back to those biblical characters who have experiences of anger and punishment and sadness, but never quite express disappointment, I also couldn't find there exactly the antidote. Mostly what they do is get up and go on with their lives, which is a pat answer, but in some way the whole answer. They pick up the pieces and they move forward. Maybe no one more powerfully than Moshe Rabbeinu, who experienced the ultimate disappointment of not being able to lead his nation into the land he had looked forward to. And all the Torah tells us is he pleaded and pleaded with God, and then did the best he could for the rest of his life until his last day. But I want to try to do at least a drop better than that and suggest that while the notion of achzava, of disappointment, has in it that sense of promises that can't be fulfilled, part of how we wrestle with disappointment is to suggest that what makes us vulnerable to disappointment is in some way three kizavim, three sort of falsehoods, fallacies, or mistaken assumptions that if we could tweak in our own lives, we could help ourselves protect ourselves just a little bit more, or arm ourselves for encountering disappointment, which will inevitably come. And these are my own thoughts, and I offer them humbly. The first is the idea that part of what makes us liable to disappointment is conflating hope with expectation. It's turning coulds into shoulds. It's confusing the spring, which ultimately may or may not burst forth with water, with the sun, which will always shine the next day. If I look at the things that I hope for in my life and expect them, if I say not just this could happen, but this should happen, I expose myself. It's a beautiful thing to put all of ourselves into it, but I also expose myself to greater risk of disappointment. If I can hold on to hope without transforming hope into absolute expectation, I can manage a little better when the things which I hope to happen don't happen, because I don't expect them to happen. That's one thing we can consider as we look at the things we yearn for and long for in our lives. The second sort of fallacy or assumption I want to tease and push against when I think about how we cope with disappointment, is the fallacy of control. It's the sense that we could have made this thing be different. And of course, in some of the pieces of our lives, we could. We made a promise and we didn't follow through because we really didn't try hard enough, and we could have tried harder. That can lead us and the people in our lives to tremendous disappointment. But we also remember that sometimes the circumstances really were beyond our control. If we made a promise we ultimately couldn't follow through on, or if we invested ourselves in a project that just didn't come to fruition. Sometimes it was because of circumstances that were beyond our control. And while we feel the tinge and the twinge and the sting of it not coming out the way we wanted to, we can protect ourselves a little bit from crippling disappointment by remembering it wasn't all in our control. And the third is perhaps to try to remember sometimes that disappointment comes from narrowing our lens to the current moment, instead of broadening it out to include the past and the future. Remember when Yirmiyahu said to God, you've become like a spring whose waters don't flow? In the next verses, which I didn't include in the source sheet, God says to Yirmiyahu, hold out hope. That spring will yet burst forth. I will be there for you, and I will not disappoint you. Stay the course. And I would want to add in God's voice to Yirmiyahu, you don't even know the impact your words may have already had on people. Yes, it looks like they haven't heeded. Yes, it looks like they haven't transformed, but you've planted seeds that may yet bear fruit. They're the same words that if I were sitting down with Captain Vandenberg, I would want to offer him in some small way. Remember that you're not totally in control of the outcome. Remember that you went in with high hopes, but hopes are different than expectations. And remember that those women did wear blue jeans, and those hills were reclaimed until they weren't again. And who knows if they yet will be again. Remember to broaden the lens from now to include the past, the Elul and Tishrei in which I did achieve those goals, and the coming Elul and Tishrei in which I may yet again. A second reflection. If you Google 20 years 9/11 reflections, I found that the most frequent theme that essayists and columnists were writing about this week and this month was the change in our country from what were at least moments of powerful unity to the time we live in now of incredible fractiousness, divisiveness, and the incapacity to even share space or feel safe sometimes with those fellow Americans with whom we disagree. I wish it wouldn't take a catastrophe or a crisis to bring us together. But 20 years ago, in the wake of 9/11, it felt like there was a time of unity. People came together across faiths, across denominations. People hugged each other in the streets. People reached out and gave from deep within themselves to total strangers, transformed their lives for days or weeks to give and give and give, to grieve together, to hold hands. There was a unified sense of purpose in this country, whether it was about how to respond or how to build back, or simply to uphold our indomitable spirit as Americans. I don't know how long it lasted or how deep it was, but it was potent and powerful. And it was a vision of how, in some way, I think we ought to be. And we're in another moment of crisis and catastrophe in COVID, yet it feels so, so different. A time in which some sense of unity, and there have been moments and times of unity in COVID, but a time when unity is so desperately needed and it feels so far away. A letter was sent home to families from a summer camp this year, in which the leaders of the camp reflected in the challenges of this summer. One of the things they expressed is that they experienced a phenomenon amongst the adolescents, amongst the tweens and teens they had never seen before, where in disagreeing with one another, they couldn't even stay in the same room. One would say, "Your opinion doesn't make me feel safe." And the other would say, "Your opinion doesn't make me feel safe." and the conversation couldn't continue. I feel afraid for the future of our country and the future of our humanity when I hear about things like this. But I don't put the burden on our adolescents. It's because of where we are as a human society, as an American society, and in many ways as a Jewish community. It's so important to strongly hold our opinions, but it's more important to be able to share space and community with those with whom we disagree. Something of what we had in that time 20 years ago, we have to try to reclaim. And I want to argue for a few moments that there's perhaps no deeper message from the high holidays than the message of striving to create unity amongst diversity and difference. It comes out most powerfully from the words we sing on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur in the Amidah. May the awe of you, the reverence of you, God, be on all creation. And may we therefore come, because we all share something common, which is an appreciation of that which is greater than us, of that which created us. V'yeyasu chulam agudah achat, lasot retzoncha b'levav shalem. May we all form a single band, a single bond, God, to do your will with a perfect heart. What is this single band, this single bond that the tefillah is referring to? One of the ways of getting at this notion and this language of forming one band or bond or unit is by journeying forward from Yom Kippur to Sukkot. The Midrash in Vayikra Rabbah talks about the Arba Minim, the four species that we will hold together as a community, and hold as one in our hands on Sukkot. And this Midrash, I've just excerpted it for you here. And the next two Midrashim, I think, have beautiful, deep messages, but have some hard messages within them too, which I'll try to soften, even while acknowledging that they're here. The first talks about the four species as four different kinds of members of the Jewish community, across the axes of those who have relationships with and embody Torah, and those who don't, those who have relationships with and embody good deeds, and those who don't. And the four species are all four, have and don't of each of these two qualities. And the last of them is the Arvei Nachal, the willow, the brook willows, which are those which have no smell and no taste, and therefore are like the people who have no Torah and no good deeds. What does God do about those people? Here are the sort of shivering words. La'abedani efshar, to destroy them is impossible. On the one hand, even the thought that such people, as much as they may be lacking in these categories, would be worthy of destruction is one which causes you to shudder. But at the same time, the message here is to push back, of course, against that. They cannot be destroyed. They're human beings. They're God's creations. But where do they fit in the Jewish community? They don't lift up the two central values that we have, Torah and good deeds. So God says, throw them in with everybody else. Yuksheru chulam agudah echad. Bind them up. Make them as much a part of the community as anybody else. V'hein mechaprin elu al elu. And while I think the plain sense of this midrashic line is to say those who are endowed of good deeds and Torah will atone for the others, I want to offer a midrash on the midrash and say that it might even mean, and they, without Torah and good deeds, who are possessed of other qualities, can atone for the others who may have Torah and good deeds and not possess those other qualities. Everyone has a redeemable aspect within them, and we need everyone in order to be one and in order to atone for each other and fill in that which each other lacks. And if we do this, if we hold those who are like us and those who are different, those who hold our values and those who hold other values, and just hold together the most central notion of unity, God will be elevated. Imasitem kach, if you will do this, I will be elevated, says God. This is the meaning of the pasuk in Amos. God who builds God's upper chambers in the heavens. How does God get to the heavens to build an upper chamber? What makes God elevated to the high heavens? It's when we are one bond, and binded unit, one bound unit, as the pasuk continues, Va'agudato al eretz yisada, when God's grouping is all one on earth. Therefore, Moshe said to the Jewish people, take these four species all as one. And I think the Midrash wants us to understand, Ulekachtem lachem bayom harishon. Take yourselves all together on the first day. This first day, in a sense of the new year. Yes, it's the middle of the month of Tishrei, but Sukkot is its own new year. What do you do on the very first day? Take yourselves together. Get together as one. It's the vision of all being under God's vast sukkah. Make an agudah achat on the very, very first day. And then, says God, I will be elevated. It's the same language which is used for the shofar. Allah Elokim b'Teruah. God is elevated through the shofar blasts, but God is also elevated when we form one unit. I think the Midrash drives this home in an even stronger way with the following parable. Give me a little time to unpack this. A parable about two who went into a judge. When they came out, we didn't know who was victorious. Two people go into a courtroom for a case and you're standing outside. They come out of the courtroom. How can you necessarily tell who won? Maybe one is smiling and one is frowning, but that could be for any of a variety of reasons. How do you know who was victorious, who was acquitted, who won the court case, who was judged in their favor? The Midrash says, and I have no idea what ancient world reality this is referring to, but the Midrash says, the one who comes out carrying a palm branch is the winner. Apparently that was the custom. You were the victor in the court case, you got a palm branch, and that's how you know when people were standing outside the courthouse who won their case. So too, Israel and the nations of the world come and prosecute each other before God on Rosh Hashanah, and we don't know who won. Now, what's this fight all about? It's not a very universal vision to imagine the Jewish people and the other nations fighting each other. But if you look down to the second paragraph where it says Israel was victorious in the trial and their iniquities were forgiven, even though I still don't love this Midrash, it seems to suggest that the other nations took an adversarial pose and wanted to say to God, don't forgive the Jewish people. And how do we know that the Jewish people were victorious and were able to convince God that we should be victorious, that we should be forgiven? How do we know? Because when we come out of the courthouse, when we emerge from Yom Kippur, we have Yisrael yotzin milifnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu ve'lulavehen ve'etrogehen biyadan. We come out with our four species, meaning what? We come out with our agudah achat, with our four different kinds of Jews, with our four different kinds of people, all bound as one. And for me, the deeper reading of this Midrash is to say, the vehicle of judgment is agudah achat. If you come out with agudah achat, then I know you were victorious and your sins were forgiven. Meaning if you emerge from Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, not judging one another, not seeking to be divisive, but upholding the most fundamental value of unity, then I know your sins will be forgiven. Because God can get over those misdeeds if God sees God's children emerge from Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur embracing, holding each other as one. And in fact, that's the mitzvah of the Arba Minim. It's not just to take them. You read the pasuk, take on the first day of Sukkot, these four things. How do you take them? Pick one up, put it down, pick one up, put it down. What's the mitzvah? The mitzvah, says the Shulchan Aruch in source 13, is for every individual to take a lulav, 2 willow branches, 3 myrtle branches, and then umitzvah la'agidam. It's a mitzvah to bind them together with these bindings. And then what do you do when you've got those 3? You take the agudah, you take the bunch with the right hand, and then you take the etrog in the left hand, and you put them all together, because one thing can't quite get around the 3 species and the etrog. So we use our hands as the ultimate agudah, binding and holding all those disparate, maybe even diametrically opposed parts of our community, of our Jewish people, and I want to read more expansively of humanity as one. For me, this is one of the central goals, missions, and challenges of the high holidays. What it means when we come together, yes, and in these COVID times, we don't all come together in the same room, but we do that activity on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur of closing our eyes and thinking about each other in all the spaces that we are, whether it's the 6 tefillot of the Bayit and those who are at home, whether it's our family, loved ones, and friends spread around the world davening, whether it's our work colleagues, those we've connected to across the year or across our lives. We take them into our hearts. We think about the areas in which we profoundly disagree with them. We think about the stances they hold that make us uncomfortable. that we even feel may be harmful. And we say, along with that, can we hold them as fellow family members, as fellow Jews, as fellow human beings? Can we do that work of trying to figure out the biggest rubber band that can hold us together as an aguda achat, and seek that oneness to come out of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur embracing each other? If we can, then I think we can live in the promise which comes in the Haftarah of Yom Kippur, which in some way returns us and binds together these two reflections: the reflection of coping with disappointment and seeking to be people who do not disappoint and people who uphold our word, and finding our way to transcend the times when we disappoint ourselves or disappoint each other, and the hope for unity. In Yeshayahu 58, after talking about the fast that we often think about on Yom Kippur, of beating our chests, of bowing our heads, of refraining from food, Yeshayahu calls out in God's voice, "No, this is the fast I desire. Unlock the fetters of wickedness and untie the cords of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, to break off every yoke. Don't make the wrong kinds of agudot. Don't bind people together in judgment, in harshness, in injustice. Let all those people go and create not agudot." And in fact, in another powerful rabbinic source, the Torah says in Lo titgodedu, don't make yourselves agudot. Don't bind yourselves into small groupings, even as powerful as those sub-communities might be. Make yourselves aguda achat. And in doing so, untie those who've been unfairly yoked or oppressed. Make yourselves aguda achat. And then bring in all those people who make you uncomfortable and who you disagree with and don't have the same life experiences as you, the hungry, the naked. Then darkness will turn into light. Then God will answer your cry as we partner with God, offering compassion. And the gloom and the darkness of 20 years ago, and the gloom and the darkness of the last 18 months will turn back to light. And then God will slake our thirst and give strength to our bones, the chilutz atzamot we pray for every month, we so desperately long for in this time of physical faltering and compromised health. And then God says to us, the thing that you thought human beings couldn't be, I promise you to be. V'hayita kigan raveh, u'chemotza mayim, asher lo yechazvu meimav. You will be like a spring whose waters do not fail. You will learn how not to disappoint because you expand your circle to include others, to be broad-minded and broad-hearted, inclusive and connective, even as we have so much to challenge each other about and with, to disagree about and to engage upon. It's my wish as we hold 20 years ago, first and foremost, remember those who fell, cherish their lives, their qualities and their characteristics, those who gave their lives rescuing, who model for us what it means to run towards challenge, run towards disaster, rescue and relieve, as we mourn their loss and uphold their lives and their values. As we think about where we are 20 years hence and where we want to be, may we strive to transcend disappointments and failures, to moderate, hold on to hope even as we loosen expectation, control that which we can and let go of that which we can't, broaden our lens from the current moment to feel proud of what we've achieved in the past, even if fleeting, and to believe in what we can yet achieve in the future. And even with disagreement and challenge, to expand our communities to hold each other towards a vision of unity and of life. Zochenu lechaim, melech hafetz b'chaim, v'chotveinu b'sefer ha'chaim, למען Lefancha Elohim Chayim. With love and gratitude to every member of our Bait family, with appreciation for the privilege and blessing of being able to be together in this way and in every way. All should feel welcome to unmute and wish Shana Tova one to another. Shana Tova.
Shana Tova.
Tova.
Shana Tova.
Shana Tova.
Shana Tova. Thank you so much, Stephen.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Shana Tova.
Thank
you, Rabbi.
Wonderful to see you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Yasher koach. Yasher koach.
Thank you so much.
See you soon.